Welcome to C2GTalk, a series of one-on-one interviews with influential practitioners and thought leaders to explore the governance challenges raised by emerging approaches to alter the climate. I'm Mark Turner, Senior Communications Consultant with Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, and I'm speaking today with Michael Taylor, who is a Professor of Climate Science and Dean of the Faculty of Science and Technology at the University of the West Indies, Mona campus. Professor Taylor was a coordinating lead author for Chapter 3 of the Special Report on 1.5 degrees of the IPCC and the 2019 ANSA Caribbean Laureate for Excellence in Science. Professor Taylor's work has been invaluable in furthering understanding of the Caribbean's vulnerability to climate change and more broadly in informing government efforts to bolster the region's resilience. He's also led on research into whether solar radiation modification could be an option to help restrict global warming to 1.5 degrees and how it might affect the Caribbean climate. Amongst other accolades, he was recently picked by the website Apolitical as one of the 100 most influential academics in government. Michael Taylor, welcome to C2GTalk.
Thank you very much.
Great, well, let's dive into it. How would you describe right now the impacts of climate change at the current level of warming of around 1.2 degrees C on the Caribbean region?
Okay, all right. So the first thing I would like to do is probably just make the case to succinctly describe the physical manifestations of climate change. So how do we see climate change in the Caribbean region? So we see it in a number of ways already. The first is, of course, warmer temperatures, and that's warmer land temperatures or warmer ocean temperatures. And we have seen about the same 1.2 degrees Celsius that the globe has seen. Of course, this has translated into many, many more warm days and many, many more warm nights. So we see the warmer temperatures. We also see, of course, a shift in rainfall pattern. So for us, the rainfall has become way more variable. So one year it's extremely wet, and then the next year it's just extremely dry. And we see this great variability, as well as changes in how rain falls, long stretches of dry, and then we get really, really intense hurricanes. We also see the 1.2 degrees as extreme weather. And for us, extreme weather tends to be, of course, hurricanes. And we can trace, some amount of climate change impacts in the hurricanes, and especially in the intensity of the hurricanes that we have seen. But it's also droughts, so region-wide droughts and longer, more severe droughts. And then, of course, the last one I would mention perhaps is sea level rise. So we have seen it, especially because the Caribbean is made up of a number of small islands in terms of rising sea levels, reclamation of coastal, land, but you definitely see the sea level rise. Why all of that is important is that when you think about the physical manifestation, then for us in the Caribbean, what 1.2 degrees warming already has done has created what I would call a multi-hazard environment, because we don't see one versus the other or one then another. We see multiple of these manifestations happening at the same time. Right. So for us, that 1.2 degrees is the creation of a new multi-hazard environment in which we must live. And so the 1.2 is both intensity and frequency. That's a physical manifestation. Why is that so important for Caribbean life? There has to be an understanding that Caribbean life has this extreme sensitivity to climate, and there's a strong dependence on climate for quality of life. Mm-hmm. And this strong dependence, emerges from a number of things. Well, the first, of course, is that we are small, and so we can't escape. So when you have a event like a hurricane, it's the whole country that's impacted and all aspects of life that are impacted. But then we have this really strong dependence on things like rainfall for water, on things like the natural resources for the economies, for economies to thrive, whether it's agriculture or whether it's tourism, and so you get this really ingrained sensitivity to climate that really pervades everyday life. It's not that an event has to happen. You have this strong, sensitivity, and it kind of helps to shape what Caribbean life is. It's an outdoor life. It's very sensitive. So having said all of that, put the two things together now. So if we have this strong sensitivity, and yet we are beginning to see these changes in climate and changes as we have never seen before, I think this is how I would describe the impacts of climate change. First, what we have seen already is bringing about a disruption of total life. Yeah. So when a climate event happens, everything gets impacted. Every sector, whether agriculture, tourism, finance, health, water, the first impact is just a disruption of the total description of life. The second thing would, however, be a degradation of our way of life. This is literally eroding the Caribbean way of life. What's that way of life? It's our outdoor life. It's our dependence on natural resources. It's our livelihoods. It's our coastlines. So it's degrading our way of life. The third thing I think it is doing is that it is presenting a barrier to a better way of life. We all have defined development pillars, and all of those development pillars are hinged on climate, whether it's agriculture or tourism. Well, these development pillars cannot consistently deliver. And so it's, posing a barrier to a better way of life. And then the last thing I would say about it is that it's creating a disproportionate impact on Caribbean life. The truth is, even if you compare other small islands, the latest research suggests there is more damage in the Caribbean. The Caribbean is more likely to be hit by a disaster. There is more percentage of our population impacted. There is this disproportionate impact on Caribbean way of life. That's what I would say the 1.2 that we have seen already is doing.
So very real and very present, even today. How would you see the impacts of reaching 1.5 degrees, which now seems likely according to most analysis, or 2 degrees or even higher?
Right. So, if we actually should head towards 1.5, so we would see what I've already defined continuing to happen, so that disruption of life, that degradation of quality of life, that kind of developmental delay, and that disproportionate impact. Those would continue to happen, and those would continue to increase, in their scope and impact, and how many people are impacted, how Caribbean life is impacted. But I would say, the Caribbean has long defined 1.5 degrees as a threshold for viability. The Caribbean was part of the push globally, and came up with the slogan 1.5 to stay alive. Why does 1.5 kind of represent that threshold? Well, for us, it's that kind of threshold because a couple of things happen after 1.5 from our perspective. One, after 1.5, we don't just kind of enter an environment where we see multi-hazard every now and then, or beginning to happen more frequently. I think we enter into a realm where the unprecedented now becomes inescapable. So we reach warming temperatures where temperature records will be broken, that we have never seen. We reach drying conditions as we have never seen before. So when we begin to go there now, we now get into the realm of the unprecedented, cannot escape the unprecedented. When we go past 1.5, the levels of vulnerability become expanded, and that's critical. So we already have defined, in the current environment, some key climate vulnerable people. And you can almost begin to think of them, clearly farmers in our context are key climate vulnerable people. But so are, people with certain kinds of diseases that are climate sensitive. Well, when we reach 1.5, you not only expand the population of those who become more vulnerable, but you almost as well create new climate vulnerable people. So you're expanding the levels of vulnerability, and that will include now not just people, but biodiversity, heritage sites, which were not designed for this kind of intense climate, outdoor workers, children, elderly, even a future generation becomes part of this expanded vulnerability after 1.5. So you expand the vulnerable after 1.5 and 2. And then the last thing I would say perhaps is when we reach 1.5, we all have signed up to these 17 SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. The kind of research that is being done says that these goals get pushed farther and farther, or the achievement of these goals gets pushed farther and farther away. And these development goals almost become unattainable, for the Caribbean region. And so for us, the impact of hitting 1.5 or even going higher is really significant for these reasons.
So given this extreme significance, it's a difficult question to answer, of course, because there's so many different physical and social factors.
Yes.
But what chance do you see? Do you see a chance still of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees C? And what would need to be done? And I realize that's an almost impossible question to answer in a couple of minutes, but just share whatever thoughts you have on that.
Sure, you're right. It's a very difficult answer. I worked on the IPCC 1.5 report, and that report actually laid down some pathways to achieving 1.5. I would have to argue that scientifically, the pathways have not all closed as yet. So they clearly laid down some conditions for reaching 1.5. Not all of them have closed yet, though the window for really achieving it is narrowing and narrowing and really, really becoming small. So we know things like, you have to cut carbon emissions, let's say by 50% before we reach 2030. There's still slim possibilities of doing that. We have to ramp up the natural ways in which we sequester carbon, the mangrove reforestation and afforestation, those kinds of things. So there's a slim chance, which we want to hold on to, of limiting global warming to 1.5. No, admittedly, the other side of that, which is the kind of global agreements that you need and the ramped up ambition to do that, you're not seeing that currently on the table. And so though the scientific pathway to do so exists, the other necessities that would have to enable those scientific pathways to be followed are not yet on the table. And so it's really a small, very, very, very tiny window if we are to achieve it, and perhaps not looking so likely right now.
So I'd like to dive into a little bit about the regional response, both as individual countries, but also as a region, and then also as a group of people with a voice on the international stage. And we sort of pick some of these separately, but just actually from the region itself, or even we could just take a single island, what kind of preparations, response, ability to respond, whether through mitigation or adaptation, do you see at the moment? What are the sort of kind of headline responses that you see being undertaken by governments and society in the region?
So regionally, the first thing I would say is that I think the region has coalesced around the fact that there needs to be a response. I don't think if you come through the Caribbean and you talk to any government or even people on the ground, there's not a realization that climate change is really impacting us as a Caribbean region, and we need to respond. So the response is, the first regional response is a recognition and an awareness of climate change and the need to respond. Then I would say we are beginning to think through what the nature of that response should be. For a long time, the region and various countries have focused largely on adaptation. And that's a recognition that, even though we put 1.5 on the table, 1.5 is not a safe target for us. It may be the one that we're saying, okay, the world must coalesce around, but we have seen what 1.2 has done. 1.5 is certainly not going to be safe. And so adaptation for a long time has been one of the main thrusts of the Caribbean region. Now, that will look different for different people because of different contexts. So, for example, water is a huge challenge for a country like Barbados or Antigua, or the coastal zone resources, especially in the Eastern Caribbean, where the islands are much smaller So adaptation would focus on those. Those which have agriculture still as a main economic activity would focus on agriculture. Jamaica has placed a fair amount of emphasis on resilient infrastructure, and protecting an agricultural industry. So, but you will see adaptation as one of the huge responses. It will vary as you go across the region. More recently, the Caribbean, however, has taken up mitigation as well. And people will argue, well, but the Caribbean is one of the smallest emitters, So I think part of the taking up of mitigation, though, is recognizing that we don't excuse ourselves from the responsibility to mitigate, but also because of the co-benefits that the particular ways in which we would mitigate will have. One of the key ways is the move towards renewable energy. Right. In the region. And a number of our islands have set really ambitious goals. So if you take, for example, Jamaica set a 50% goal for renewable energy to be the main energy source by 2030. There are other islands that have set even more ambitious 100% goals, but you see a coalescence around it. Why? Yes, because of the mitigation, the reduction in greenhouse, but also it removes our fossil fuel dependence as well. And certainly has other benefits, like, in an extreme event, renewable energy is quicker to get back up, especially if it's decentralized renewable energy, that kind of thing. So mitigation is now emerging. Renewable energy is one of the key planks of mitigation, but you're also beginning to see it again, dependent on where you are. Forestry is also emerging as a mitigation activity in say, for example, Jamaica or some of the Caribbean continental countries. Waste is emerging, again, because of the co-benefits. We need to deal with waste, especially to deal with our environment. Transportation. So mitigation has emerged as a second kind of approach. And then one which I think the Caribbean has always picked up on is just education. We have always seen that, public education, national campaigns, putting it into curriculum, high school and university curriculum, workshops, tools, decision-making. I think those are the kinds of ways you see the Caribbean rising to respond.
So taking that from the sort of the Caribbean to the international level, how do you see, let's ask two questions maybe. First of all, to what extent do you feel that the Caribbean and all the concerns you've just expressed and the challenges is making its voice heard adequately at the international level? To what extent are you helping to push sort of an international consensus towards action? And then perhaps on a slightly different side, to what extent are you, through internationally, getting the kind of support that you might need, whether technical or financial or whatever other kind of support, to undertake the mitigation and adaptation activities you talked about?
Okay, so one of the good things that has happened in the last couple of years is that the Caribbean has realized that individually, as individual nations, your voice is small. But certainly when you begin to collaborate and talk as a region, the voice becomes bigger. There's a lot of internal cooperation in the Caribbean on climate change. So we had that lesson internally. If I just give you quickly a couple of examples. So, for example, CARICOM, which is one of the major economic groupings within the Caribbean community, started what was called the 5 Cs, the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. So that center led the Caribbean in putting down some of its regional approaches, strategies. But then there are a number of other regional bodies that we have long had, the OECS, the SDEMA, which is our disaster management and emergency, the University of the West Indies, of which I am a part, which has coordinated research around climate change, and the Caribbean Development Bank. So we have always known that regionally, we have a better chance of approaching this than individually. Yeah. I think what the Caribbean has done is taken that now to the international stage. Mm-hmm. And so you will find that the Caribbean, for example, going into a COP, prepares and comes up with its regional approach and its regional strategies. And what are the key agenda items that we want on a COP? And So on the international stage, we've taken that kind of collaboration forward. AOSIS would be a good example. So you join with others who are the same kind of vulnerable position. And with that kind of collaboration, and with going in with a united voice, I think the Caribbean voice has gotten much stronger on the international stage. And you would see it in, for me, some of the successes are, one, just the recognition of SIDS. You know, for a while, as a part of the IPCC process, I met scientists who didn't have a clue what SIDS represented, you know, but now know that SIDS are small island developing states. So recognition that SIDS as a vulnerable grouping deserve recognition and you know, and to be treated as a special grouping. I think the 1.5 is a success of the Caribbean voice. And it's, you know, it's collaboration on the international stage, that it is put on the table, that it is a global target, that the IPCC would produce a report on it, that kind of thing is a success.
So sorry, because I hadn't realized the pivotal role the Caribbean played in putting 1.5 on the table. So it really was the Caribbean that sort of helped the world coalesce around that goal.
Absolutely. You can trace the history of the 1.5 going back, and you will see that for a long time, actually, going, you know, the Caribbean had put a 1.5 agenda. Now, did they have the research to support it? Not necessarily at the time when it was put on the table, but they were part of that key grouping that put 1.5 degree on the table. And again, in collaboration with others. And so that also, you know, was why it was so important for us to make sure that we had a research agenda to support 1.5 and that the Caribbean's voice in the 1.5, because for us, that is a defined threshold, 1.5 to stay alive. And then the third success, I would argue, you know, is joining with the other, and these now are not only small island developing states, but other vulnerable nations in putting loss and damage and finally getting recognition for loss and damage, even if it is just recognition right now, you know, but loss and damage has always been mooted and probably always been pushed a little bit to the side, but now there is kind of formal recognition. I would argue that those are some of the successes of the Caribbean developing this collaborative voice.
Yeah, well, no small success either. I mean, that the loss and damage issue was one of the few bright spots of what happened at the last COP. So
absolutely.
Perhaps I could turn then to an issue that we're focused on in C2G. Given all the challenges, even in the best of circumstances, you know, there's a threat of very serious risks coming up, and as a result, and we haven't even begun to discuss tipping points and so forth. So there is growing scientific research into whether this idea of solar radiation modification, the idea you'd reflect back a small fraction of incoming sunlight through various means, could play a role in reducing the risks from overshoot. And you've done some of this research yourself. I don't know if you could tell me a little bit about what we know about this idea and, you know, some of the potential risks, benefits, governance challenges, and how we actually even go about learning about it in the first place, given that, you know, some of this is a theoretical idea right now. I'd be very interested in hearing a little bit about that.
Okay. So we've done a little bit of research, not a lot, I must admit, and that's part of the challenge we can speak about with respect to, you know, solar radiation modification. Probably to put it in a little bit of context, you know, and why it is important for us as small island developing states, you know, to even be in this discussion, is some of what I've said before. There is this growing urgency to tackle climate change and tackle it in real ways that can be transformative, you know, and that will include research, as well as, we haven't spoken yet about some of the gaps, you know, what are the hindrances for the Caribbean, which includes financing and that kind of thing. But there is this strong urgency. For us, we recognize that we were one of the people who were putting 1.5 degrees on the table. And so probably visioning and looking ahead, we feel that there might come a point where the Caribbean will have to take a stand with respect to how to achieve this 1.5. And there might even be pressure to go after technologies about how to achieve it. Well, there is this group of technologies that is being put forward on with respect to solar radiation modification, technologies aimed around cooling the Earth. And there are a number of different kind of technologies, all based around, kind of the air, well, a number of them based around aerosols. So you put aerosols in the stratosphere, or you add sea salt aerosols to the clouds to reflect brightening, to reflect, or what they call, marine cloud brightening, But the idea is these are techniques that somehow would decrease the amount of sunlight that reaches to the Earth's surface. And in so doing, you are modifying the solar radiation and cooling the Earth, So these are some of the techniques that have been put on the table. Now, you will know that in current times, there's been a lot more talk about these techniques. I think, again, partly for the context I laid down, the window for 1.5 is closing. The current methodologies or the current global will to do the ambition, increased ambition, is not stepping up to the plate. So these technologies are gaining more and more, I would say, discussion, about whether they should be utilized. For us in the Caribbean, we believe that we must have a voice in that.
Yes.
And I think that is important, and that is our motivation for even beginning to do some research. Now, there would be some benefits. I don't know if you could run away from the fact that the potential for cooling or even slowing or even going towards 1.5, maybe after overshoot, you could use it to bring down. That there would be some clear benefits, I think, for the globe. The problem, however, is multiple. First, in the Caribbean, clearly one of the big problems is it doesn't stop the emissions.
Yeah.
And that becomes a challenge. One of the key things about emissions, for example, is the acidification of the ocean. It doesn't stop the acidification. No, I just argue that the Caribbean, especially small islands, are very dependent on our natural resources, including our oceans, which represent a huge part of the resources that we have. So that becomes one of the challenges with pursuing this. The other big challenge, of course, there are huge uncertainties associated with this. These are things being mooted right now. But we don't know how, for example, they will manifest. How will they result in the changing climate result by, if we do a large-scale SRM experiment? Who will benefit? Where will the deployment be? Who will not benefit? What will be the rate of cooling? Does the rate of cooling matter? We don't quite yet know many of these details or the manifestation. If we don't know those, then we certainly don't know the impacts either, So translate now the climate changes into the impacts. And remember, small islands are extremely climate sensitive. So we don't know the impacts on agriculture and livelihoods and vulnerabilities, that kind of thing, all right? So there are huge uncertainties still involved in it. And with those kinds of uncertainties, in the present climate system, there are a number of inequities already existent. Who gets to be the major voice? Who gets to, where's access to financing? Who decides what research is to be done? That kind of thing. So those inequities which exist currently have the potential to be even magnified more now on an SRM. And then, of course, in the Caribbean, because of the strong association with climate, you also have to talk about cultural acceptance as well. So though, SRM is one potential, there are these huge uncertainties around it.
So given these uncertainties, first of all, do you advocate more research? And I realize it's not an endless pie. There is some sense that maybe research here might not be money for research there. but do you advocate more research? And what are the sort of challenges facing researchers in the Caribbean or even in the Global South more generally, in terms of kind of basically getting access to the computers that they need and information they need and having their voices heard in the right international scientific circles? I'm just interested on this research point. What would you see as needed over the next 10 years on SRM research?
So for us, certainly one of the things that we advocate is we must be able to put the Caribbean in a good position to speak about this. And so in that context, research then becomes important, but it can't be research that excludes the Caribbean's voice. So I would argue there is need for research on SRM. I think there is need for a lot of research on how you would deploy this. I don't think the Caribbean is at a point where it would support any kind of deployment without this kind of research. So you need to know the effectiveness of SRM, how different interventions would play out in terms of climate change, the ability to detect and attribute the impacts of SRM, the governance structures, the ethical dimensions, the safeguards that you would need, the policies, you know, all of this. So, but research will be needed to support all of this. The model simulations, the observations, the analytical studies. So I would argue that research is necessary, but now we have to put some, I would say, some considerations as we do this kind of research. Certainly from our perspective, we must have a voice in deciding the kind of research, the focus of that research, you know, including things like the experimental design, the impact studies, the governance, you know, and we must, and it's critical for the Caribbean and the small islands to have a voice in that kind of research because of the overwhelming, we are at the front line of the vulnerability. So yes, research, but we must have a voice. We must have not only a voice, but we have to have the ability to engage in the research and engage at comparable levels to everybody else doing the research. So it mustn't be able only help to direct, but we must also indirectly have the ability to engage. And that right now, even for climate change as it is, mitigation, adaptation, that ability does not exist, you know, to engage and have access to the resources for research. And if we don't sort that out, then I think we are at a challenge with how to go forward with SRM research. You know, it is a legitimate fear, you know, that if you pursue SRM, you are going to take away from other aspects. And we must not hide from that fear or hide from that reality. You know, the Caribbean would have great concern about, you know, if SRM becomes a replacement, for example, for mitigation, and you take the attention from the increased ambition that's needed, the finance, and even research and investment into mitigation, you know, that would be a real fear of the Caribbean region. SRM research must not represent a shortcut to a future. In other words, you can't do it at the expense of research and other approaches. And so I think where I'm arguing is you'd really have to scale up the research abilities within the Caribbean to participate in this research, to provide the Caribbean contextual lens through which to view SRM. And that needs to be, I think, one of the critical things on the table as we discuss SRM going forward.
I'm going to ask a slightly mischievous question because I don't think it's possible to answer it, but how would you ever know that you knew enough? Would there ever be a point at which you could say, yes, we've now reached enough of this research level and it is sufficiently on a level with the research level of others to actually start taking decisions about SRM? How would you know when you had reached that point? Is it possible to know that? Or is it more that you have to do the research and then political things will happen and in the meantime you just learn it? What are your thoughts on that?
An interesting question. I don't know if I can answer it, except that I would say the question isn't even so much for us as opposed to the global SRM governance and research community. The truth is, with the Caribbean's voice has increased with respect to climate change, and especially small islands and the least vulnerable voice has increased. If SRM is to really take a place as a possibility, I think it is only going to take that place when the places like the SIDS, the least developed countries, the Caribbean feel comfortable enough to begin to include it as one of the suite of options that are out there. So the global SRM community actually has to play a strong convincing role when the Caribbean can begin to talk about it openly and freely as, oh yes, this is a viable additional element in the suite of options, then I think we would have known that we have done enough research to do so. But until the conversation switches.
Yeah, well, could I maybe turn that one around a little bit? Because of course, it's a decision to do something, but it's also a decision not to do something.
Mm-hmm.
And, there are both pressures from the North maybe to go in this direction, which is, but there are also pressures from groups in the North to not go in this direction. And I'm wondering to what degree you may actually see it almost the other way around, that being on the front lines of climate change, a region like the Caribbean might actually be pushing reluctant groups in the North to consider this. I mean, I'm just wondering which way around the pressure is going to go.
And I don't know, but I think for now, with our known knowledge of the inequities with respect to climate change, there are a couple of things the Caribbean would definitely put on the table before we decide, which way to go. And I think, as I've been trying to allude to them, not at the expense of other research or other approaches, So if at all, it must come within a suite of solutions, but not at the expense.
Of course.
The Caribbean would probably put on the table, not without current asks being met, So the urgency and the amped up ambition, the financing, the global financing to support adaptation, there would have to be a comfortableness, if I can call it that, with the current asks and the ability to meet them, access to finance, easy access, that kind of thing. I think they would say not without a governance framework in place, and that government framework would have to have some key characteristics. It has to be inclusive, it has to be well-informed, has to have independence, that kind of thing. So I would almost say that the Caribbean right now is saying, research in the context of making sure we have a voice.
Where do you think that governance process, I mean, it can take place in many different places, but where would you see its natural home?
I can't tell you that one. The home, I'm not sure, but wherever it lies, or even if across a number of institutions, it has to allow for everybody's voice.
I have one more question about SRM research, if I may, and it's just because one thing that I learned as I looked into it, obviously to understand what the impact of SRM might be on fisheries, health, whatever it may be, you have to both know what climate change would do, and then you have to know how SRM might affect that. And from what I understand, perhaps you can correct me, and it may be different in different regions, but actually, once you start to get down to the regional impacts on fisheries or climate change or whatever, actually, there's so much we still don't know even on that. True. And so actually, sometimes you get the sense that SRM science, by doing this comparison between these two things, is actually just climate science, because you're learning things at a I don't know if that's fair or not to say, but I mean, you're still learning things at a degree of sort of, specificity in terms of location that you might not have otherwise known.
So I agree with you, however, well, and let me start with, I agree with you on the fact that there is so much we just don't know in the regular climate. And again, it kind of speaks to my point, you know, not at the expense of that kind of research. But certainly, you know, knowing what SRM might do also adds additional information. And so for us, where I was suggesting that the SRM research becomes important is for us to set those kinds of baselines, certainly to have, you know, knowledge of what it might do, additional knowledge of what climate is doing versus what SRM is doing. And so the research for us is still at that level. Okay. Certainly not at the level of deployment and that kind of thing. Yes.
If I could just finish on a personal note, it's something I often ask people is, you know, the more you learn about the climate challenge, there could be a sense of hopelessness that creeps in. It's just such a big problem. And there's only so many times you can read some of these reports and just think, wow, I'm not sure how I'm mentally processing this. You actually sometimes just almost have to stop processing it to be able to process it. How do you maintain a sort of a sense of agency and hope and keep going? Well, both for yourself, but also, you know, for your students, given the just huge complexity and enormity of this task?
A very difficult question, if I may say. I think a couple of things. One, I want to argue that there's perhaps just this kind of natural resilience within the Caribbean region. You know, we have gone through some really difficult things. Slavery being one of the huge ones, you know, and the region has emerged as a resilient region. So seeing this within that kind of context as a challenge, but we have the ability to be resilient and overcome is one of the things that keeps you going. Two, I think if we celebrate the kind of successes we have seen so far. So, you know, the Caribbean voice has really emerged and some of our issues have really become the global issues. The recognition of the vulnerabilities, the recognition of the need to give the most vulnerable a chance. So some of the successes help to buoy you and say, we must keep going. I think youth themselves, you know, there's an optimism and especially an increased activism amongst young people. And I think seeing that and the willingness of youth to hold the rest of others to the you know, to the fire or say, you know, we need action, gives you a sense of optimism that there is potential for change, you know. So those are the kinds of things that I think help to keep me optimistic. And in the end, you know, I do have a basic belief in human beings that the common good and the desire to have the common good can emerge, it still exists, and perhaps can still emerge as the dominant desire, you know, to guide a number of these actions.
Well, on that very positive note, I want to say, Michael Taylor, thank you so much. This was a fantastic C2G talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much for having me.